Welcome to First Wednesdays. I'm Linda McKeever, and I'm president of the Mark Skinner Board of Directors, which hosts First Wednesdays in Manchester. I'm really excited to be here tonight because as we speak, there's a new library growing in Manchester. In case you haven't noticed, it's on the corner of Cemetery Avenue and 7A. So watch us grow, because hopefully next year we will be hosting First Wednesdays in our new community meeting room. All right. People are gathering tonight at 9 First Wednesday sites throughout Vermont, exploring thought-provoking topics that educate, enrich, and inspire. We are grateful to the Vermont Humanities Council for providing this lecture series to the people of Manchester and our surrounding communities. The Vermont Department of Libraries is the statewide underwriter of First Wednesdays. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Keelan Family Foundation. Our Manchester Library sponsors are the Perfect Wife Restaurant and Tavern, the Spiral Press Cafe, and Vermont Renewable Fuels. Thank you, sponsors. We thank the First Congregational Church for again providing the venue and gnat-tv for taping this evening's program. A sign-in sheet is being passed around. Please sign it if you would like to receive emails from the Vermont Humanities Council about upcoming events. After this evening's lecture, please take a moment to fill out the feedback form that is on the piano to my left. The Humanities Council welcomes your ideas and suggestions about the First Wednesdays series. October marks the resumption of foreign language conversation groups at Mark Skinner Library. The library is once again teaming up with BBA and Maple Street School faculty members to help you brush up on your German, French, and Spanish language skills. Check the library website for more information. Join film scholar Harvey Flaxman for a film and discussion series in October at the library. Harvey will present a trio of classic buddy films, beginning with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid on Thursday, October 10th at 6:30 at the library. Mark your calendar for the next First Wednesday's talk on November 6th, when NPR On Point host Tom Ashbrook presents A Life in the News. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Antonia Losano, who will reveal Victoria's secrets. Antonia Losano joined the English and American Literature departments at Middlebury College in 1999. She teaches courses in 19th century literature, gender studies, mystery fiction, and the intersections of literature and the visual arts. Her book on women writers and painters in the Victorian era, The Woman Painter in Victorian Literature, was published in 2008. She has also published articles on women travel writers, the Bronte sisters, Virginia Woolf, and exercise videos. Currently, she is working on a book on the history of solitude. She received an MA from UNC Chapel Hill and a PhD from Cornell University.
I have to turn on all my gizmos first before I do anything. Hi, thank you for being here. I want to start tonight's talk the same way I start my classes at Middlebury, and that is by asking my students what they think of when they think of the Victorian period. And so I would just like to hear your responses. And since I am a professor, I will call on people if you don't answer. So tell me, not necessarily when you see Victoria up there looking so dignified, but when you think about the Victorian period, when you think about Victorian literature, what images, what ideas, what words come into your heads? Your grandmother. That's wonderful. So the past. Yeah. What else?
How very long books written during Victoria.
Good. Okay, good. How very long books written. Okay, good. Very, very long. There's sort of the killing cockroach effect of the Victorian novel. So the tomes. What else do people think of when they think of, yeah? Innovation. So what kinds of innovation? That's interesting. Good. Technology too? Yeah. Sorry, she says she thinks about technology, innovation. So innovative things. And again, I think that works with architecture, but also with something like any of the technologies that are coming down the pike, the telephone, the telegraph, and all of those things that are part of that Victorian era. Railway, steam, all of those things are part of that era, this long period. What else do people think of? Yeah, what do you think of? Empire. So he thinks of empire. Absolutely. This is a global nation. What did you say one?
Family.
Families, absolutely. Victoria famously married for a very long time to Prince Albert, and I think they had 9 children, an incredibly domestic woman, even though she was queen. So very much a family-oriented culture. Are there other, pardon me? Propriety, absolutely. That's what we think of. We think of propriety. We think of people very thoroughly dressed all the way head to toe. We think of propriety. Other, pardon me? Rigidity. Good. So rigidity of morals, rigidity of ideas in certain ways. Strangely, kind of when you put that with empire, it's an interesting tension between those two things. Yeah.
Those terrible things that women had to wear around their waist.
Corsets. Corsets, single-handedly responsible for killing many women, okay, for the very large rate of miscarriage in the 19th century, and for decimating populations of whales across the globe because the corset bones were made of whale bone. So that's something we definitely think of when we think of, and nowadays when people dress up as neo-Victorian with steampunk, thank goodness the corsets are no longer made of whalebone, they're made of some kind of groovy plastic. Are there other, yeah, what do you think of? Pardon?
Osborne House.
Osborne House, that's wonderful. What do you think of? Repression, good. So repression, rigidity, in this interesting combination between innovation and rigidity. And that, in a certain way, my students tend to generate some of those ideas. They don't usually generate the empire and the innovation ones. They do tend to generate the rigidity and those that seems to be what we associate with the Victorian period. The other thing that I've taught this for 14 years, 19th century literature, and almost every single semester, one student will raise their hand and they'll say, I think of Jane Austen. And I have to say to some poor Middlebury College student, they don't like to be wrong any more than the rest of us, I'm really sorry, but Jane Austen was not a Victorian. And they get that kind of petrified, teary look in their eyes. And I have to say, Jane Austen is 20 years. She died 20 years before Victoria took the throne. Austen died in 1817. Victoria takes the throne in 1837. So Austen cannot be temporally, chronologically, she can't be a Victorian. But I have to tell the student, actually, it's okay, because ideologically, emotionally, and culturally, Jane Austen is kind of a Victorian. When we think about Jane Austen novels, when we think about the things, certainly the BBC reproductions of Jane Austen novels, we think about some of those same families, repression, rigidity, some of those cultural problems, or cultural norms at least, that characterize the Victorian period. So I can tell the student, you're not necessarily wrong, because in many ways, Austen is a Victorian. The other person who's associated very strongly with the Victorian period is Thomas Boulder. I don't know if anybody knows his name, but he gave us the word Boulderize. And he's also not a Victorian, which is great. So he published his Family Shakespeare. So he's the guy who went through all of Shakespeare plays and took out the dirty bits. And he publishes those in 1809. So he also is not a Victorian, but we think of the Boulderized Family Shakespeare as this sort of classic Victorian thing. But in fact, they are before the official Victorian time period. So I'll show you a couple pictures of other things that you might think of when you think of the Victorian period. This is Victoria. This is Prince Albert's dog. I don't know if these are familiar, but these are just to sort of set the stage and think these are some of the things. And the word rigidity suits this very nicely. Even in the animals, they are perfect and proper and dignified. All right. That I think of as a kind of classic, this is what women did. This is called the perfect wife. So she has her flowers, she's organizing things, she's clearly in a domestic space, she's clearly involved in that Victorian enterprise of making the family beautiful, but she's not necessarily doing much else outside of it. So I'm going to leave this up for a little while. All right, as I move on. My argument, or at least what I want to talk about, is to say that these ideas of Victorian culture, these ideas of repression and rigidity, A, are not correct, which is an easy argument to make, and I will show you some reasons why they're not correct. But the other is that they're necessary, and that we need somehow, and that's the question I want to ask at the end, is why do we need to keep thinking that they were repressed? After all, people managed to have babies in the 19th century. People managed to procreate and continue the species. In London in the 1860s, there were, for every 5 females, there was 1 prostitute. All right, so that's quite a remarkable sort of structure. They had an incredibly organized and prolific pornographic, literary, as well as visual culture. So we know all these things. Historians know all these things. So why are we so invested in still thinking that they were repressed? Somehow I think we find that pleasurable, all right, or at least culturally important. So that's what I'm going to try to figure out today, and what we can sort of work through is why we like to think of them as repressed, unimaginative, devout, and some of these other terms that people have used. Here's another one to show you. This is the other reason I love this, besides the fact that it's so quintessentially Victorian, because they are so thoroughly dressed, and because of the railway. They're in a railway car. Is that the painter's name is Augustus Egg, which just makes me laugh, which is also one of these quintessentially Victorian names. All right, and there's another image of what we think of as the quintessential. This is a little later in the period, so her dress is getting a little bit more modern, but we still see her as fully dressed and doing something that women did in the period, which was play the piano in a domestic setting and an environment. All right, so that's what we think of when we think of them. And the last one is that, all right? So something else we associate is this kind of, if you've read The Importance of Being Earnest, we think of this sort of grande dame, as well as that picture of Victoria that I showed you. We think about a certain strangeness of attire, but a kind of weightiness of culture that we get. But again, high-necked, stiff-necked, and not particularly vibrant of motion. You'll notice none of these pictures showed anybody moving or doing anything dramatic, all of them very static. And I think that's what we think of. So because we think of this, or at least because when we think of Victorians, we want to think of them as repressed, my students and other people always love it when I tell them the story of Effie Gray. And I don't know if you've heard the story of John Ruskin and Effie Gray. John Ruskin, many of you may have heard of. He's a 19th century art historian and scholar. They called him a sage. And when he was, I'm trying to see if I have her name. Incidentally, if you get interested in Effie Gray, Emma Thompson has done a screenplay called Effie Gray. It's coming out in October. She has a bit part, and I think it will be wonderful, because anything Emma Thompson does is wonderful. So Ruskin, who's this art critic, he fell in love with Effie Gray when she was 12 years old. He formally requested her hand in marriage when she was 15. Her father suggested they wait a while. When she was 19, they married. After 5 years of marriage, Ruskin had still refused to consummate their marriage. Effie wrote to her father, and this is a direct quote from her letter, quote, "He alleged various reasons, hatred to children, religious motives, a desire to preserve my beauty, and finally this last year he told me his true reason, that he had imagined women were quite different to what he saw I was, that first evening, 10th of April. That was their wedding night." Scholars have had lots of sort of questions about what it was about his wife's body or person that upset Ruskin so much. One scholar has suggested that Ruskin, who was trained and sort of took the grand tour through Europe, would only have seen marble statues, and so we're not aware that women had pubic hair, because marble statues tend not to. Now, that doesn't make much sense to me, because he also walked through the Louvre, and I think if you walk through the Louvre, you probably have a really good notion of what people look like, clothed or unclothed. But there was something about her physical body that disgusted him and distressed him. So there are other reasons that they have put forward, but nobody has ever really gotten a handle on this. Eventually, Effie met, through Ruskin, the painter John Everett Millais. And they fell in love, and she requested an annulment. And after a very ignominious formal public medical trial where her virginity needed to be proved in front of an audience, she was allowed to marry Millais. Her marriage was annulled, and she married Millais. She bore him one child for every year and a half for 12 years, 8 in all. So clearly there's nothing wrong with Millais or with Effie Gray. Ruskin went on to fall in love with another 12-year-old girl several years after this, when he was in his 50s. And so I tell the story, and everybody goes, yeah, that's the Victorians, right? That's who they were. They were Ruskin. They were weird and perverse and repressed. There was something wrong with all of them. And that may be true, but the great thing about Ruskin is that he is a complex figure. If you know about Ruskin, you know that it's Ruskin who discovered and made sure he became famous J.M.W. Turner. All right, and if you know the works of Turner, I think this is my next one, at least I hope this is my next one. Actually, I don't think it is. Yeah, I'll show that. There you go. All right, that does not seem like the painting that somebody like the Ruskin I just described to you would like, does it? I mean, to me, that is epic. It's called Rain, Steam, and Speed. All right, and it's a Turner painting. Yeah, sorry, is there a question? Was Ruskin? They do not think so. No. It is. That's one of the questions. She's asking, was Ruskin homosexual? The scholars of his life do not appear to think so. All right? And so because there is no evidence that he had any relations with males. He may not have known it. So we don't know. But there seems to be something clearly, very quintessentially Victorian and repressed about Ruskin. But that's one part of his life. The other part is this part, that he could discover and propagate and find beautiful paintings that no other Victorian at the time could stomach, because it didn't look like, I'll go back a second, it didn't look like that. All right? So we've got to figure the complexity of people out here. So Ruskin discovers Turner. All right? So now you think maybe Ruskin's all right. Let me tell you one more thing about Ruskin, that you won't like him anymore. When Turner died, and Turner was this unbelievable painter, absolutely wonderful, and Ruskin eventually was his really only friend and patron. When Turner died and Ruskin was going through his effects, Ruskin discovered a cache of about 500 erotic sketches. And Ruskin wrote about them in his journals, and he was clearly traumatized by them. They were very explicit, and this was his idol, and he had spent all this money and done all this patronage, and now he discovers that his idol has this dark side. So the story goes that Ruskin burned them all. All right? Which, okay, I love it. Nasty man. Okay, so now that has been the story, that Ruskin burned these paintings for about, this would have burned the paintings, I'm trying to think my dates, in about 1870. What does that put? 5 years ago, the Tate realized they had about 500 erotic paintings by Turner in the basement. Where did they come from? All right, so they have started, and if you get interested in it, there's a wonderful book called Turner's Dark Side, and it investigates what Ruskin did or did not do. We have thought all along that Ruskin burned. He said he did. He said he burned them. He said he couldn't take the tortured horror of seeing these erotic drawings by his idol. And suddenly we realize we still seem to have them. So we don't know now what Ruskin did or did not do. So this is for me, that's the way the Victorian period works. You think somebody's okay, then you think they're perverse, and then you think they're okay. I have one of the drawings. Doesn't do much. This is from the Tate of Turner's erotic drawings. They're not really easy to see, but just to have a sense, they're very stained and highly problematic. But if you see them in person, they're wonderful, like everything else of Turner. All right, I will put this up. This is what Ruskin should have liked, right? But he didn't. All right, so clearly, I guess my point at this stage is that repression is more complicated than we think. And that maybe if you are problematic in one area, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to extend to everything. So even though we now know that maybe things are more complicated, we're still invested in believing that Victorians were prudish in some way. And that goes into the literature as well. Somebody over here said big, thick, heavy novels, and those are the ones we remember. All right, so if you think about Victorian novelists that you remember, the big ones might be George Eliot. Who else do you remember? Charles Dickens. The Bronte sisters, good. All right, who else do you remember? Dickens, and all of Dickens' novels except A Christmas Carol, which is about the only one anybody reads anymore. But all the other ones are at least 800 pages long. Middlemarch is 900 pages long by Eliot. All the Bronte novels are quite extensive. Trollope, if you ever get interested in Trollope, you can weight down flowers with Trollope novels. They're excellent for this, right? But those are the books we remember, all right? Now again, why is my question? Because those are not the only books that were written. Those are the books that Penguin Classics has decided to keep for us. Why did they choose those books? What is this investment we somehow have in this kind of realist world? So what is it about these things? I want to read one excerpt from a realist novel to give you a taste of it in your head, because then I'm going to switch and introduce you to some of these other works of literature which were actually more popular, and there were many more, much more prolific of this other side of literature. But first, here's some realism, all right? It's from George Eliot's Middlemarch. And this, if you know the story, is Edward Casaubon, who is an elderly scholar, and he is writing a letter to Dorothea Brooke, who is our young heroine. And I won't tell you what the letter means because you have to figure it out. All right, here it is. Well, I'm about to read my own stuff. Actually, I'm about to read something from Dracula. You don't want that. You can have the Dracula later. Okay. My dear Miss Brooke, I have your guardian's permission to address you on a subject than which I have none more at heart. I am not, I trust, mistaken in the recognition of some deeper correspondence than that of date in the fact that a consciousness of need in my own life had arisen contemporaneously with the possibility of my becoming acquainted with you. Does this make any sense to anybody? Okay, good. That's fine. For in the first hour of meeting you, I had an impression of your eminent and perhaps exclusive fitness to supply that need, parentheses, connected, I may say, with such activity of the affections as even the preoccupation of a work too special to be abdicated could not uninterruptedly dissimulate, end parentheses. And should I keep going? All right, he goes on for a long time. But I have discerned in you an elevation of thought and a capability of devotedness than which I had hitherto not conceived to be compatible either with the early bloom of youth or with those graces of sex that may be said at once to win and to okay, it goes on. He is asking her to marry him, okay? He never says that, but that is why, and it goes on, there's more, and I won't read it to you because it's really, really terrifying. But that's also what we associate with Victorian realism, is that diction that is very difficult for me to read and very difficult for you to comprehend, but also this way of talking around something as theoretically passionate as a proposal of marriage. Right? And so we think of Casaubon as this kind of test case for these are the Victorians we know and love, and these are the classic Victorians. So given that, let me go back and show you some of the other stuff, right? Because we think we know the Victorian period, and we think we know all the literature from this Victorian period, but in fact, in the 19th century, we see the rise of genre fiction. So we think it's all realism, but the 19th century saw the greatest rise in all of what we now call genre fiction: mysteries, science fiction, detective fiction, erotic fiction, children's literature. What am I missing? I have a list somewhere in here. Anything that you might think of that we now call genre fiction. The important thing about it is they didn't think of it as second class. So when you walk into Barnes & Noble's, is Barnes & Noble still in business? Is the other one that went out of business, right? It's Borders that went out of, okay. If you walk into a Barnes & Noble, and you know that there are those distinctions, right? There is this category called literature, right? And that's the goal, is to get your book there. But then there's a category called fiction, and I'm never really sure who decides what goes where. But then there are all those little lesser things, right? The sci-fi is over here, and the mysteries are over there, and the romance novels are somewhere way in the back, and they're all pink. And but nobody wants to talk about those. But everything is someplace different. In the Victorian period, it would all be called literature. They did not do this distinction. And every major writer whom you mentioned wrote something in genre fiction. George Eliot, who penned that awful letter of Casaubon's, wrote a really, really strange ghost story about a man who could literally read minds and how completely psychotic that eventually made him. It's called The Lifted Veil. It's wonderful. Dickens, if you read any Dickens, you'll know, of course, that he did A Christmas Carol, which is not a realist fiction. Trollope is a little different story. He tried to write some really strange things. It didn't work because Trollope was just really good at realism. But all the major writers knew that realism was not enough, that you needed something else in your life in order to make things expressible. All right? And let me give you a quote just quickly from Henry James so that you can hear the distinction. And Henry James, if you know, he needed both those genres too, right? He needed the realist genre for The Portrait of a Lady, and then he needed the other, whatever you want to call it, for The Turn of the Screw. So he understood that both of these things were absolutely necessary for a full creative impulse. And here's how he describes it. The real, so he means realism, represents to my perception the things we cannot possibly not know sooner or later in one way or another. The romantic, and by that he means just non-realist, the romantic stands, on the other hand, for the things that, with all the facilities in the world, all the wealth and all the courage and all the wit and all the adventure, never can be directly known. Things that reach us only through the beautiful circuit and subterfuge of our thought and our desire. So for him, this other things that are out there, that's what he wanted to access with this genre fiction that he was writing as well, with the sci-fi and all these other things. So what are these genres? Where do they come from? First of all, before I launch into them, they're incredibly popular. All right, more non-realist books were published than realist books by about 40 to 1, all right, in the period. There are lots of questions about why this is the case, why in this particular period. The first you've got to realize is the rise of the printing press. All right, the Victorian period was awash in paper. It was absolutely drowning in print. And somebody had to read something, and you couldn't always read Middlemarch. You had to have something else to read. The other is the rise in literacy rates. In 1840, 45% of the population was literate. By 1880, it's 85%. That's a massive spike in the literacy rates. Part of this is because of the institutionalization of mandatory schooling, but there are other reasons too. So suddenly you have all these people, and they want to read all the time, and they don't want to read Middlemarch all the time. They want something else. So that's one of the reasons that we have this huge flood. So let me give you a tour of some of these crazy genres and books hopefully you've never heard of, and I'll read you little bits or tell you about them. And then my sort of question is, given that these things are out there, why do we still want to believe that the Victorians were repressed and prudish? What's the payoff for us hold to that sort of closely guarded secret? All right. So the first genre I'll talk about is science fiction, the paranormal. If you've read Frankenstein, you'll know that that's sort of the beginnings of what we think of as science fiction. Cyrano de Bergerac, the guy with the nose, also wrote a wonderful story earlier than Frankenstein, which the French say is the first science fiction because the French and the English like to argue about these things. And it's a moon trip. It's actually quite wonderful and very, very strange. So we have these two early science fiction novels, but then the 19th century sees a flood. So hopefully you've heard of some of these. H.G. Wells, we have The War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau. We have Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Some of these have lasted, all right? But we have other ones too. So here's a title of one of the most popular novels published in 1871, which is the same year Middlemarch is published. So it's 1871, and if there had been a bestseller list, this would be at the top. It's called The Gorilla Origin of Man, or The Darwin Theory of Development, confirmed from recent travels in the New World, called Mui Me Ainia, or Gossipland, by, and here's the author, His Royal Highness Mammoth Martinet, alias Moho Yoho Me Oo, which we assume is a pseudonym. At least I hope it's a pseudonym. That's on the top of the bestseller list. It took me about 5 years writing my dissertation to find a copy of this book. I knew it existed because people write letters about how exciting it was. Have you read The Gorilla Man? No. Have you even heard of it? No. So this is, and everybody had heard of Middlemarch, okay? But so same year, two very, very different texts. Also in 1871, we have a novel published by Bulwer Lytton. And I don't know if that name rings any bells, but if you know the phrase, "It was a dark and stormy night," you know Bulwer Lytton because he started one of his novels with that phrase, "It was a dark and stormy night." Incidentally, if you are computer literate and you Google the Bulwer Lytton contest, you will get the coolest thing in the world, which is a yearly contest where people invent the worst first lines of novels that they do not intend to write. And so every year they will publish the best, worst first line of a novel. The one I liked best was just "The Camel Died at Noon." That was it. And that won several years ago. But Bulwer Lytton was an incredibly well-respected, even though he's given us "It was a dark and stormy night," incredibly well-respected and incredibly popular novelist. And in 1871, he wrote a novel called The Coming Race, all right, which again, top of the bestseller list. This novel, I'll tell you a little bit about it, just so you can have a sense of what people write about. There's a young, independent, wealthy traveler, who's our narrator, who accidentally finds his way into this subterranean world occupied by this mysterious race called the Vrilia. It's almost an inversion of the Time Machine. So underground, we have the Vrilia, who are these telepathic creatures, perfect and beautiful in every way, ultimately powerful. Children of the Vrilia can destroy civilizations with one thought. And they live underground, and they don't have any means of power that our narrator can see. And eventually he decides and figures out that it's created by this force. It's called vril, and it circulates underground, and it's giving them their power. And as the novel progresses, he realizes that they are outgrowing their subterranean domain, and that they are making plans to come above ground and take over the earth, because of course human beings on the top are not particularly interesting, and it would be very easy for them to destroy all of London at a single blow. I will not tell you how it ends in case you want to go find this wonderful book, but this is how it begins, at least. So you can hear echoes, hopefully, of a lot of contemporary, certainly you could have that contemporary plot in any sci-fi novel or fantasy novel. There's another one I'll just introduce. If you like The War of the Worlds, if you are a War of the Worlds fan, about 40 years before that, Richard Jefferies wrote a novel very similar called After London, or Wild England. It describes an unspecified ecological disaster. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Okay. Unspecified ecological disaster, and describes what will happen to the human race once the entire civilization has been destroyed. The towns and the cities are all completely destroyed. Pets have perished. Domestic animals have reverted to the wild. And the only human beings are left are the ancestors of the nomadic gypsy tribes, all right, which is what they would call them in the 19th century. The gypsy tribes, who are the only people who have been able to survive in this this desolate place. And I also won't tell you how that one ends. It doesn't have a happy ending, all right? Because these sort of tales of desolation, the sort of post-apocalyptic tales, rarely had a happy ending. But this is a 19th century text. We don't know it, all right? It's out of print, and yet it seems to be incredibly current and important for what we're even thinking about in contemporary times. The final category of sci-fi that I'll just introduce is the vampire tale, all right, which the Victorians essentially create. The first known vampire tale actually happens a little bit before, in the Romantic period, with Lord Byron's Doctor, if you get interested, who wrote a story called The Vampire right before. But the Victorians were fascinated by vampires, and they kept writing vampire tales. They had an extended serial novel called Varney the Vampire, which is actually really funny. They had comic operas of vampires. Sheridan Le Fanu, who was another incredibly popular one, had Carmilla, which is our first female vampire. We have lots more. Dracula, which is in 1897, at the end of the century, is only the culmination of an entire century's obsession with vampire tales. All right? And the important thing to know for the 19th century is that vampires occupied pretty much the same space they do now. I don't know how many of you have, say, read or seen or heard about this thing called Twilight, or read or seen or heard about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Vampires did the same thing for the Victorians. They were repositories for all of our erotic desires that regular realist human beings, particularly human men, couldn't satisfy. All right, so we have all of these, or females if you have the female vampires, but it is a place for the superhuman, all right, for the ultimate in power, somebody who's lived forever, somebody who knows everything, somebody who is both human and animal. All of those things the 19th century writers of vampire tales knew as well or better as Stephanie Meyer's, but she's pulling it directly from that tradition. So don't think it starts with us. Okay. So the sort of Dracula place seems a good way to segue into another genre, which is the genre of erotica, which the Victorians also had in droves out there. Officially, it is illegal to publish erotica in the British Isles. They had a wonderful thing called the Obscene Publications Act of 1857. I'll read you some of the language just because it makes me happy. It is designed to protect, quote, women, children, and the feeble-minded. So men can fend for themselves and read whatever they want, but women, children, and the feeble-minded needed to be protected. So all of these publications were, in fact, illegal in Great Britain. But, as Bogart says, we'll always have Paris. And Paris was very happy to print and ship as much erotica as Britain wanted. So it was a very useful place. So most of Britain's publications in this field were coming from the continent. On the continent, in Europe, in France in particular, you have an enormous number of out-of-work printers, because we had a whole bunch of revolutions, political revolutions in the 1840s, and then they stopped needing to print seditious pamphlets, but they had these printing presses, and they were used to being arrested. So they figured, why not print porn? Because we're used to being arrested and we have these printing presses, and they did. And that seems facetious, but it gets at a deeper point, which is that the tie between political radicalism and genre fiction is a strong one. That printing non-realistic, it can be erotic, it can be sci-fi, printing genre fiction, printing anything other than the norm is in itself a rebellious act. And all of these genres seem to me to exist to be rebellious acts. The crazy guerrilla man of London is a rebellious act against Casaubon and Middlemarch. Not literally, but in a certain way, emotionally. Right? To say these things are important, as Henry James says, these are the things that are from our thoughts and our desires, not that these are things from our rules and our rigid laws and strictures. All right. So these are where we get all of this. The most popular 19th century pornographic, it's a literary magazine, it's called The Pearl. We still have many copies of it. It's published over about 10 or 20 years. Serial fiction, light poetry, all different kinds of things make this incredibly popular. The other 19th century erotics things, I'm in a church I won't go into because I have some things I could read out loud, but I think I'll skip it and you can see them later and we'll go outside of the building. But again, they are incredibly sophisticated. This is it is a laughing matter, but it's also part of their culture. It's things that educated men, for the most part, but sometimes educated men and women discussed over dinner. It was an important intellectual part of their lives. So it's also a way that they express some of these radical desires out there. All right. This seems like a good time to get this off the screen, just to show you that this is also happening in art. That's such a great contrast. Let me do it again. This is what we think of when we think of the Victorians. This is also Victorian, all right? This is Alma Tadema, and it's called In the Tepidarium, so in the hot place. It is not necessarily what we think of, although Alma Tadema was a beloved Victorian painter. It is clearly on that slippery slope towards whatever you want to call an erotic painting. The way she's holding the feather, the thing she has sort of curved at her back, which is very erotically shaped. There's clearly not just a pleasure in the female nude in this painting. Something else is going on. And this is shown in the Grosvenor Gallery, so plenty of people, regular old Victorians dressed up in their proper garb, would have seen this. Here's another one. This is William Etty, E-T-T-Y. He's a fascinating case. Several months ago, the BBC put out, if you get interested, a series called The Genius of British Art. I think it's episode 4 that's simply called Flesh. And it's an investigation of British Victorian erotic or nude drawing. So this is put forward as saying, look, this is what the British do when they paint nudes. The British were laughed at by French painters because they couldn't paint the female form. British painters could paint things like that, but only the French thought that they could paint things like that. Renoir is credited with saying at some point, somebody asked him, how do you paint with your hands all gnarled and twisted? And he said, I don't know what it is in French, but he said, I don't paint with my brush, I paint with my penis. And the British, the sort of corollary to that goes, the British paint with everything but. Right? And that may be true. But if you think about a Renoir, and I didn't bring a picture of a Renoir, and I should have, but if you think about a Renoir, they're lovely. They're wonderful, they're beautiful paintings, but they're not sexy paintings. And I'll tell you a little side story. When I was younger and I was with my husband and we went to a Renoir exhibit, and he went off. He's not really interested in painting, so he kind of wandered off ahead of me, and I stayed behind, and I walked up, and I entered this big, beautiful room, and all the Renoir nudes were on the walls in this big room, and I thought, my husband will be in here, I will find him. And he was in there, but he was over in the corner staring at a picture of Renoir's onions. And I thought, honey, a room full of nudes, what are you doing? And he said, none of these are interesting. These women, these are just like these lumpy bodies. The onions are so sexy. I thought, you're weird. But he was right. And I went back and I realized, I don't care what Renoir thinks he paints with, but he's better at onions than he is at naked bodies. And one of the things that the BBC production argues is, if you paint without repression, you might not paint that well if what you're painting is an erotic subject. Etty, it's E-T-T-Y, was very conflicted about painting the female nude, and he tended to tremble when he painted the female nude. And I think it shows that what we have here is a female nude in tension, that there is something going on. If you think about, she has to have a scarf covering her privates, right? Because that's a classic thing. Usually the scarves covering privates in paintings are a little bit less taut. All right? So he's clearly painting that and drawing your attention to the tightness of what is covering her privates. There is clearly something sexual going on, or at least something erotic, that he is too repressed to articulate, but he is desperately trying to still articulate it. So I think that's where this having a repression can sometimes lead to, perhaps, producing something that is oddly more erotic than it might be if you just sort of lay it all out there. Whereas if Renoir was frightened of onions, that's why the onion painting is just so gorgeous, because clearly there was something going on, something in tension there. All right, I'll leave that up there because it's nice to look at, and we'll just have that there. The last genre, and then I'll stop, is mystery fiction. And this is the other thing that the Victorians sort of took and ran with. And they didn't invent it. Arguably, Oedipus Rex invented it, Sophocles invented it. People will say that that was the first mystery, was Oedipus's questions about where he came from, and he's a detective. Mom, where did I come from? Let me find out the truth of this matter. Very often people will say that the biblical story of Susanna and the elders is our first mystery, because we have people actually cross-examined in that biblical text about the truth of some event. But we have all kinds of things from the Arabian Nights, from the Romantic Germans. So the Victorians didn't invent the mystery, but they did perfect it, as they like to think, because they invented Sherlock Holmes, okay? Who is it, and who is, in my opinion, just sort of the be-all and end-all Victorian. If you take Sherlock Holmes and you think about his relationship with Watson, you pretty much have in a nutshell everything I've been trying to say. Watson is the proper Victorian, all right? Watson has a wife. Sometimes people think Watson had 2 wives. Watson has a job. Watson did distinguished military service. All right? Watson is a narrator, which is also very important. Watson is a teller of tales. He is invested in the social order. Okay? There's one short story, I think, where Holmes narrates it. I don't know if anybody's ever read it. It's awful. Doyle should never have allowed Holmes to try to take the first person, because Holmes is not invested in the kind of communicative system that Watson is evidently. So Watson is our perfect Victorian, but he is not cool. He's not Sherlock Holmes. You have to have both, all right? And Holmes is absolutely anti-establishment in every single way. And it's not just the drug use. He's anti-marriage, he's anti-establishment, he's anti-church, he's anti-state, he's anti-government, he's anti-police. I can't make, he's anti-absolutely everything, and yet he is arguably the one Victorian character that most of us remember, all right? And he is the one Victorian character who got the Victorians more het up than any other character except Little Nell, all right? Little Nell is from the Dickens novel, and when Little Nell, the scene where, because these are things that are published serially, and when Little Nell was on her deathbed and they were being published in Britain and then shipped over to America, the captain of the steamship who had the most recent Little Nell episode, when they were coming into New York Harbor, he got the megaphone and he began to read it to a crowd of about 5,000 people waiting to hear what happened to Little Nell, right? So that's how much the Victorians loved their realism. But in the Sherlock Holmes story, I'll tell you how much they loved their non-realism. If you know the Holmes tales, you will know that there were 12, I think, published in this sort of first one, and then Doyle got really sick of Holmes and killed him off, right, in Reichenbach Falls. He got a telegram from his mother, Doyle did, that said, the day after it came out in the Strand magazine, "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you." That's from his mother, okay? People in the streets of London wore black armbands, the mourning bands, for months. All right. The subscription rate to the Strand magazine, which published the Holmes stories, dropped by 90%. They were not happy about this. That's why he resurrected him. Doyle really wanted to write really, really bad historical novels, but he couldn't, because he had put his finger on the pulse of what the Victorians wanted, which is somebody who wasn't what they thought they were. They wanted somebody who was anti-everything they had busily been constructing and would make them laugh at themselves and realize that they weren't the center of the universe, right? So in a certain way, Doyle and his character Sherlock Holmes are the best place to stop, but I'll stop with just a sort of final argument and then some questions to you for comments, or you can ask me questions as well. Which is, I've just told you that the Victorians had sexy paintings, and they had erotica, and they had vampires, and they had all these things. Why do we still want to believe that they were repressed? Steampunk, if those of you who have read steampunk, seems to be a really good example of why we still want them to be repressed, or at least that we do still need to think of them as repressed, because if they weren't, we couldn't have steampunk. All right, the whole premise of steampunk is that it is posited on this tension between repressive clothing and these wild and crazy adventures, all right? Other things, if you think about other historical genres that take place in the Victorian period, or any other period for that matter, where we value repression. So I think about Mad Men, the television show. It's very important that it takes place when it takes place. I don't know of any television show that is serious and a drama that takes place, for instance, in the American 1960s. Because then you'd have a bunch of happy, half-naked, sexually liberated people, and that's boring. All right, at least it's not the stuff of drama. So in a certain way, I'll leave you with that maybe we need the Victorians and maybe we need them to be repressed because we need something to rebel against, and we need something that feels to us interesting, or at least we need something that feels to us in tension from the things that, the everyday. Make sense? All right, anyway, I'll take questions. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, thank you. I see somebody raising her hand already. Let me try to see if it works. Oh, turn it on first. I don't even know how to turn it on. There you go. All right, give it a try.
How do Gilbert and Sullivan fit in here?
What a wonderful question. Did everybody hear that? How do Gilbert and Sullivan fit in there? This is going to make noise.
They tore up everything, but
Yes.
nicely.
Good, that's right.
Nicely.
She just said they tore up everything, but nicely. They are a wonderful test case. They're sort of halfway between, aren't they? They're not full genre fiction, but they are, and they're not fully proper Victorians, but they are, I would still class them with the kind of the other side, just because they were so sarcastic with the cultural reference that they were doing. But that's a really good one, Gilbert and Sullivan. All right, I'm going to walk this around. Sorry. There.
Was Wilkie Collins Victorian?
Yes.
I read the Moonstone
Yes.
when I was very young and I loved it.
Yes. If you heard that, I'm just going to leave that and then I'll move it to the next person. Was Wilkie Collins a Victorian? Yes. Wilkie Collins arguably wrote the precursor to the Holmes stories. He's in the Moonstone and then Woman in White are 1859 and 1861. And they are also part of this mystery and sensation fiction. Just so you know, Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens were best friends. Dickens did quite well. Wilkie Collins didn't do quite as well because the Victorians wouldn't read his books because they knew he had a mistress. And he lived openly with her. Whereas Dickens had a mistress and he didn't tell anybody about it. So they all read his books. But yes, Wilkie Collins is a Victorian and a really interesting one. All right, here. So there's one here and then in the back. There.
Is there any theory that Turner had 1,000 sketches and 500 were burned and then 500 were found?
I have no idea. I haven't finished it. Thank you. Wouldn't that be great? I would hope so. Because some of them, as you saw, they're so destroyed. But that's certainly one theory. I think the theory right now, again, from this book, the theory right now is that Ruskin had a change of heart and put out there that he had burned these things like any proper Victorian would burn them and could not bring himself to do it. Yeah, there's somebody there.
The Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
And Victorian literature. I don't even know.
There we go.
How did I have a feeling that the Industrial Revolution had an awful lot to do with with that culture and how that culture began to break down.
Yeah.
Very much like what happened with our information age
Right.
culture and how it has broken down and affected the novels that are written today.
I think you're absolutely right. Here's one of the things one of the literary theories that I find very, very compelling. The Victorians inherited from the Romantics this idea. If you think Wordsworth, daffodils in your head. They inherited this notion that proper literature was this, Wordsworth is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, and you went out in the woods, in the fields, and you saw the daffodils, and that's where you had it. And that's what they thought, at least that's what the Romantics thought literature was supposed to be. And the Victorians woke up one day in the middle of the Industrial Revolution and said, you know, I'm not seeing the daffodils anymore. I see smoke and rain and steam and speed. And I think that is the beginning, certainly, of literature starting to crumble. And people will say that is what causes realism to rise, because they are trying to take stock of what they actually see out their front doors, which I'm trying to figure out where this painting is. There. They're trying to take stock of what's actually there, but then they are, as you say, they're fracturing, they're crumbling because of the tension of the Industrial Revolution. So I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. There was somebody who had a question up here. Yes, you did. What was it?
I wonder if Ruskin modeled.
Oh my goodness. Don't say that. I know, that's blasphemous. No, she asked, I wonder if Ruskin modeled for any of those paintings. And I think that the Ruskin scholars would just absolutely pass out at that possibility. But who knows? I mean, he was Turner's closest friend, or at least his one patron, and the person who was with him when he died. So I think there is certainly a compelling possible read on that. That's a great one. Yeah.
Is there any parallel with all this recent this past week? What's that program, Breaking Bad?
Oh,
and
yes.
Sherlock Holmes' death? I mean, is there any parallel there?
All right, I have never seen Breaking Bad.
I didn't either until I looked at the last episode.
The question was, does there seem to be any connection between, or similarity between the television show called Breaking Bad, which I understand from my students just had its final episode. Did he die? Sorry. Spoiler alert! All right. I figure anybody who follows it probably already knows this. That would be, if people are wearing black armbands, that would be a definite similarity. Where I will say there's a similarity, I don't know what will happen if there will be enough people who are furious that they make, that they try to get them to rejuvenate or whatever it is, bring him back from the grave. I will say that the fascination with a character who has gone bad is a classic. I mean, again, this is not a happy, well-adjusted, liberated guy. This is a traumatized, tortured, etc. That's interesting. So I think that's where the similarities are present. Yeah. There's a wonderful Tolstoy quote, I think it's Tolstoy, that all happy families are the same and all unhappy families are interesting. And I think that goes for individuals as well. There's somebody else who had, I see these little hands kind of tentatively rising. Is there anybody else who wants to comment? All right, oh, wait, one more. Yeah.
Talking like modern corollaries, I was thinking about the fact that there's news that J.K. Rowling is probably going back to the Harry Potter world for very similar reasons, that she tried to go into a different field.
Yes. I didn't know that. I'm sorry, just in case people didn't hear, there is news that J.K. Rowling is going to be returning to the Harry Potter world for the same reasons, maybe that kind of deep and profound popularity of a character set that we now reference as almost as human beings in all of our cultural reference. Yeah, jump in.
But how much of what the literature you're talking about was published serially? So people weren't consuming like 800-page books.
Almost everything. She's asking how much of the literature I'm talking about is published serially. Almost all of it is published serially. So yes, people aren't contending with 800 pages, but they are contending with like a 3-year commitment. This is like huge. This is monogamy for your books. This is very important. No, but again, you're right. They didn't have the tomes. They did publish them eventually as tomes, all of them, but they didn't have them that way at first.
That's exactly like our most popular television program.
Exactly.
They go on for years and
Yes.
years and years.
Yes.
You sew them up with characters.
Yes.
We get them in small weekly bundles.
Right, and we stay up late at Borders, waiting for the 4th Harry Potter. I think I spent the night waiting for the 4th Harry Potter. She's saying the similarities between our serial television and our serial characters and the Victorians' love of serialized characters in print. It's absolutely similar. And I think the similarities in reception model, but also the similarities in the characters they wanted to follow are remarkably close to where we are now. All right, thank you, everybody. If you have more questions, come up afterwards. Thank you. Sorry about